So good afternoon. This is a webinar as part of Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month. If you've been listening to some of the webinars that have been given all month, the theme for this year is myth busting. What are things that we believe that aren't true? Today's webinar is about our ʻōhiʻa forests and protecting our forests. What are we protecting when we're protecting our forests? And what myths are there around our forests and our values of our forests? And our threats to our forests that we could learn what's actually going on. I'm J.B Friday. I'm the extension forester with the University of Hawaii. I've been going on 25 years in this job on Hawaii Island with this. I did my doctorate at UH Manoa in agroforestry. And before that, I was Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, where we also had wild pigs and domestic pigs. Our panelists today are Dr. Tom Giambelluca. Dr. Giambelluca has been at UH Manoa for 45 years. On the faculty for 40 years, he's director of the Water Resources Research Center. His group has done research on water processes and Hawaiian ecosystems, including both native and invaded forests. He's also leading the Hawaii Mesonet project, and the project is installing weather and climate stations in a network of 100 different stations around the state. Cali Crampton, Dr. Crampton is the manager of the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project. Nicolai Barca, Mr. Barca grew up hunting and fishing and has been involved in invasive weed control and ungulate control in watersheds since 2006. And he's also currently the Kauai representative to the State Game Management Advisory Committee. And last we have Ryan Perroy. Dr. Perroy is chair of the UH Hilo Department of Geography and Environmental Science and director of the UH Hilo Spatial Data Analysis and Visualization Laboratory. So what we're going to do today is go around the panel. I'll ask a couple questions to kick off discussions. Each person is going to respond to a couple, and then we can respond. If you, the audience, have questions, please put them in the question and answer, and the people who were people in the question and answer, and the people in the question and answer will be able to answer your questions there. Tom, starting with that, one of the things that we hear often is rain follows the forests. And I'd like to ask you, how do forests actually protect and influence watersheds and the things we care about when we say watersheds, such as sediment, turbidity, and recharge?
Aloha, everyone. Thanks, JB, for that introduction and that question. So I do have a few slides to show. I'll try to be quick, just talking about, giving an answer to that question about how forests affect water processes, and maybe encounter some of the common misconceptions about how that works. So these are the widespread beliefs that I commonly hear about the role of forests in the water cycle. One is the idea that they act as a sponge, kind of holding water above ground and promoting infiltration into the soil. That there's very widespread belief that forests attract or promote the development of clouds and rain. There's a commonly believed that forests can reduce flooding and erosion, soil erosion, and that they can improve a dry season spring flow and stream flow. So let's look at what makes forests do what they do, what makes them different from other land covers. One that I would cite that is not commonly thought about is that forests are dark. In other words, if you look at a forest from a distance, it looks darker than grassland or other land covers that have similar types of leaves with similar reflectivity at the leaf level. But because they're very thick and have multiple layers of leaves, they tend to trap radiation and they look dark. And as a result of that, that's really an indication that they absorb more radiation than other land covers. Forests are tall. That's a characteristic of forests, that they have tall vegetation, and they're aerodynamically rough, meaning that they cause air to become turbulent as it flows over forests. Forests have deeper roots generally than other land cover types. And that means they have access to water during dry periods. It also means that those roots stabilize the soil and promote infiltration into the soils. Forests have high leaf area. They have more leaves per ground area than other land covers. And that means they intercept more rainfall, they intercept more fog, they store more water above ground, and they also transpire more water. So the bottom line from these observations, these characteristics, is that forests end up having the highest rates of evapotranspiration of any land cover. They also intercept more fog or cloud water, and they store more water above ground and promote infiltration into the soil. So those are well-known, scientifically validated characteristics, general characteristics of forests that affect water. So let's go back to those beliefs about the role of forests. I think the sponge effect is real, and so we can put a check mark next to that. The idea that that forests attract clouds and rain, I would say is I'll put not sure right now, and I will talk about this in the next slide briefly. That they reduce flooding and erosion. I think that this is probably true in some cases, but I'll put a question mark here because it depends on the soil type and the alternative land cover that you're comparing it to as to whether forests actually reduce flooding and erosion. The idea that it improves dry season spring flow and stream flow has been widely shown not to be the case, except in special circumstances. So I would put a no on that one. So let's go back to this idea of the rain following the forest, which is widely held, not only in Hawaii, but many other places. And this is a diagram of how we get most of our rainfall, which is by orographic lifting of very moist air in the trade winds, goes up our windward slopes and gets cooled to the dew point temperature and creates this orographic cloud. So how does the fact that there's a forest or not a forest on that hill slope or that mountain slope affect things? So forests can affect rainfall by recycling more water into the atmosphere. And this is something we can see in the Amazon, for example, as air moves inland from the ocean. If it were not for the forest, that air would become depleted of moisture by raining it out. If it wasn't recycling back in the atmosphere by forests that have very high evapotranspiration, you would have less rainfall in the interior of the Amazon than you actually do now. So that's a concern with deforestation of the Amazon. In places with mountains, it may be important that these forests can lower the cloud base height. In other words, the clouds created by rising air can form at a lower elevation. And so the base of the clouds would be lower and the clouds would be bigger and produce more rain as a result. These effects are definitely can be seen at large scales such as the Amazon, but it's unlikely we would see really any significant effects of these processes, these effects of forests on rainfall in Hawaii. On the other hand, forests are very good at capturing cloud water. So in the fog zone, forests definitely increase our precipitation, but it's in the form of fog drip or fog interception or cloud water interception in that cloud zone, in the middle elevations of our highest mountains. And there's also a question about whether native versus invaded forests are different. We have been doing a lot of work on whether invaded forests, invasive tree species, transpire more than native tree species. And in some cases they do. For example, strawberry guava is probably the case. And it's also true, we believe, that native trees are better, such as ʻōhiʻa, are better at capturing cloud water interception than the species that replace them during species invasion. So sorry to take up so much time, but I'd be happy to answer more questions or discuss this further.
Tom, when I tell people, and tell me if this is a myth, that first cut is how much water a tree uses is going to be pretty well correlated with how fast it grows. Water transpiration of this. So something like most eucalyptus, at least the plantation trees we have here, are very fast growing and therefore very thirsty trees. Yep,
that is generally true. And the reason for that, as I'm sure you know, is that both the transpiration and the photosynthesis process are controlled at the leaf level by stomatal conductance, by the opening, the resistance or non-resistance to exchange of gas between the atmosphere and the interior of the leaves. So when they, plants that open their stomata can gain carbon from the air, can gain carbon dioxide from the air faster and grow faster as a result, do a more efficient photosynthesis, but at the cost of using more water, losing water through the stomata. So as they take in carbon dioxide, they're allowing water vapor to go out. And so there is a very high correlation between photosynthesis and transpiration in plants.
Great. Feel free, audience, to put some questions in the question and answer. I don't see any questions in the question and answer. If one of our other panelists has a question for Tom at this point, or we could move on. One of the things you talked about, I read a paper not that long ago about in Costa Rica, on the windward side of Costa Rica, the lowland forest has been converted to pastures. They've found that the cloud layer has moved up because you get more warming off the pastures as the wind goes over it on their windward side. I was in Monteverde up in the cloud forest 30 years ago. And then 30 years later, I was there again, and I was very surprised to see dusty roads. The cloud layer had lifted just enough that it became a seasonal place rather than a seasonal wet place.
Yep. So I did mention that effect on the cloud base height, and that is exactly what you're referring to there. And so it is possible in Hawaii that if we have, major change in the land cover in the upwind area, let's say on the east, lower elevations on the east side of the Big Island, for example, that could cause the air to become a little bit warmer as it passes over that deforested land. And therefore it would have to rise farther up the mountain in order to be cooled sufficiently to reach the dew point temperature and start condensing water droplets out and producing a cloud. So that is a possible effect. I don't think it's going to have a big effect on rainfall at the scale we're talking about in Hawaii, but it's possible that it has some effect.
Tom, I actually had a question, if that's all right. And I guess, thinking about that same situation, but maybe on the western side. So on Big Island, there's some areas with lots of erosion problems, Kawai High and places like this that I've heard in the past were, potentially covered with sandalwood and such, right? So a pretty major sort of deforestation event. And I'm just curious your thoughts about, not on the east side, but on the west side, how that might play out.
Yeah, I think in those more arid areas, losing forests can have pretty big influence on water processes and soil erosion. So the forests protect, and trees, tree cover and ground cover even more so protects the structure of the soil and promotes rapid infiltration of water so that it doesn't accumulate on the surface and start running over the land surface. So if you completely remove all the vegetation, then it is the soil is vulnerable, or it's open to direct impacts of raindrops that break up the soil aggregates and cause crusts to form on the soil that greatly reduces the infiltration capacity, the infiltration rates of the soil, and cause water to start running off over the surface where it would never have done so, or very rarely have done so in the past. So that in fairly arid areas where you can, remove vegetation and have it remain bare for long periods of time, then you can have big long-term effects on the soil and the erosion, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. So yeah, in places like that, certainly can have big impacts.
Thank you.
Cali.
Yes, thanks. I'm just thinking about all this, and especially about our mosaic of forests and bogs on Kauai, and wondering about the interplay of these rainfall patterns, these cloud patterns, and climate change on that mosaic, if that makes sense. Like, do we expect to see less ʻōhiʻa, more bogs? It's like, I'm just wondering what the future might hold given climate change and shifts in these patterns and the way all these different landscapes interact.
Yeah, that is the big question. You know, how is our rainfall going to change with climate change? And we've done a lot of work on it, and I would say it's still highly uncertain what the future holds for us in terms of rainfall change. If there's any consensus at all right now among the various downscaled climate products that we produced, it is that we have seen drying over the past century, but for the future, it seems most likely that we'll continue to have drying in the already dry areas, like the leeward areas and the high elevation areas, and that we won't see a downward trend in rainfall in the windward areas. In fact, there might even be a slight increase in rainfall in the windward areas. At the same time, I think we'll be experiencing more intense rainfall, so probably fewer periods of rain, fewer storms, and more intense storms when we do get them. And so that's definitely a negative outcome that would portend more droughts and more flood. So or maybe worse flooding or worse droughts. So yeah. But how that interacts with changing land cover is a good question, whether there'll be shifts in the patterns. There's a possibility that wind direction could shift a little bit, and that would change, the locations of the rainfall maxima. But, we don't see strong evidence for big changes in the wind direction. So yeah, I'm not sure.
So Tom, we have a point blank question from the audience. Is it then not true that rain follows the forest?
I would say it's, there's a strong correlation between forests and rain, but I think the causation goes the other way, that we have forests where there's a lot of rain because forests grow where it's wet. I wouldn't say that the wisdom of generations is completely wrong, though. I think that, our forests produce wetter environments, especially in those, in the cloud zone, where there's a really big increase. So we've done some field measurements of cloud water interception, fog interception. For example, in Upper Waikomoi watershed on Maui, in a place that gets 100 inches of rainfall a year, we measured another 40 inches that is added by fog interception. And so that's a real thing, and that is precipitation. It's not rainfall, but let's just extend the word to precipitation, and then yes, the forest does increase the amount of precipitation we get in those areas.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to have to circle back to the questions in the Q&A, but I want to move on to make sure everybody gets some time. And Cali, I've heard it said that we don't have to worry about the birds because they will adapt to new bird diseases the way they've always adapted to threats, and we don't need to worry about them. You need to unmute.
Sorry. Let me just first introduce you to the birds we talk about on Kauai, and then try to answer that in maybe a somewhat circular fashion. So hang tight. So we here at the Kauai Forest Bird, what am I? Oh, you guys do not see a slide view version. Hang on, let me stop again. Sorry. Let me get a slide view version up. Okay. Trying to share screen here. Okay, so we here at the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project are trying to ensure a future for our birds. And here on Kauai, there are 8 remaining species of birds. So I guess the quick answer to one of your questions already, or your question already, JB, is that there were formerly 24 species on Kauai, and there are only 8 left. So obviously, short answer is they're not able to adapt to all of these threats, let alone the new threat of mosquito-borne diseases. So the forest birds arrived in the Hawaiian Islands in about 5 million years ago when Kauai first came up out of the ocean and proliferated to become a number of different species. The honey creepers once numbered more than 50 species. There are, I think, 11 or 12, a dozen species of honey creeper left. So adaptation is not happening because in evolutionary time, these threats have been thrown at them in very rapid succession, and there have not been sufficient generations, nor for some species, sufficient population sizes to adapt quickly enough, because humans have only been on the landscape for about 2,000 years, which is not a lot of generations. And all of these mammalian predators, all these habitat disruptors, and now these new diseases have occurred in a couple of 100 to 1,000 years of time, and have just kind of overwhelmed these birds that were naive to mammalian predators and naive to mosquito-borne diseases. So that being said, and I'll get to this a bit more in a minute, the high interior refuges of our islands, with their cooler temperatures and their more pristine forests, have provided a refuge for our species. And so many species have retreated up to these high elevation areas, which on Kauai only range from about 1,000 meters to 1,500 meters, or 3,000 to 4,000 feet. So up in that area, Kokee and the Alakai Plateau on Kauai, you still find 8 species. There is an endangered thrush that numbers about 500 birds. The other non-honey creeper species is, sorry, the clicking is going to happen, is this Elapaio down here. But the akikee is a honey creeper. It numbers 1,000 birds, and this bird here is the akikiki, which numbers only 40 birds in the wild. So the short answer to your question, I guess, is the birds are not adapting to meet these threats. I do want to speak, if I may, or I can pause there if you have other questions, if you would like me to get into that in more detail.
Why don't you go ahead, and then we can follow up with questions.
So one of the myths I wanted to bust, however, with the forest birds is that it's already too late. So I hope here with this slide, I'm showing you that it's not too late. We do have birds to save. So when we do outreach events on Kauai, some people say, I didn't think there were any EEV left. I didn't think there were any Elapaio left. I thought it was already too late. And it's not. We have time, and we are beginning to develop the tools to save these birds. So in addition to the birds I introduced, we have another honey creeper species, the apapane, the EEV, which many of you know in the top left, Kauai amakihi, and the anianiao. So all of these species are rapidly declining due to the numerous threats that have come their way, but they are all here to be saved. So first myth busted is that. I think the second thing I'd like to address, sorry, there goes my EEV spinning in space, is that the birds do nothing for us. Like, why should we care? You know, and I guess this circles back to Tom's talk. The birds actually are incredibly important to our forests, which may, and so I would like to submit that maybe the rain doesn't follow the forest, but the birds follow the forest, and actually the forests follow the birds. So we cannot have healthy forests, which, as you heard, do provide a really important sponge for all of the rain that comes our way and help control our hydrological cycles, without birds, because they provide insect control services, because they provide seed dispersal services, and they pollinate all the important understory species. So even if you don't find an EEV absolutely charming and something that you want to go out and see in the forest, know that it is there and helping your island ecosystems stay intact and manage all this rain that's coming across the Pacific Ocean at any moment in time, as we have witnessed in the last 2 or 3. How long has this sort of successive rain event been going on? A very long time. But also, many of us really gravitate to these birds for emotional and spiritual and cultural reasons. And so to me, we also have, it's a kuleana. It's our responsibility to maintain these birds for these other sort of measurable values that just have to be with our enjoyment of the forest and our enjoyment of the environment and our tribute to the Hawaiians that were here before us and how they interacted with this environment. So I think another, if we're in the spirit of myth busting, is about the role of different species and what they do to forest birds, which is my specialty. There were no mammals in the Hawaiian Islands prior to the arrival of humans. And from the moment humans, the first mammals arrived with rats and other things, they began to alter the landscape as we know, and rats began to prey on bird species. And so one myth is that, you know, how could this happen? Well, rats are actually excellent climbers. So they do a very good job of getting up into the trees where the forest birds nest. So they have, ever since black rats in particular, the best climbing species were introduced with the Europeans, we have seen a wave of extinctions and population declines just due to the impact of rats. And no, the forest birds have not been able to adapt fast enough. And that's one of our longest playing effects on the landscape. You probably have heard a lot about the role of pigs in our landscape. And on some islands, one of the most important ways that pigs interact with forest birds is by changing the understory that provides all the food that forest birds like to eat and competing with forest birds for food. But on other islands, one thing that pigs do that they do not appear to do here on Kauai is provide the biggest source of mosquito breeding habitat for the biggest player in the room that we're going to talk about in a second. So let me get to that big guy in a second, but remind me that I need to come back and tell you the rest of the pig story. The big player in the room for Hawaiian birds is introduced mosquitoes. So no, mosquitoes are not native to the Hawaiian Islands. So if anyone thinks they are, that's a myth. Mosquitoes were introduced in the whaling era in bilge water from a whaling ship and have until very recently been contained basically at sea level because we had cold temperatures in our upper elevation volcanoes in the middle of our islands. And from the minute they got here, mosquitoes love, the mosquito I'm talking about in particular, Culex quinquefasciatus, the southern Hess mosquito, loves birds. Birds are its favorite meal. They are what we call ornithilic. And they very quickly began to spread a disease called avian pox, which is like other pox viruses, to birds. And then when avian malaria, which is a plasmodium, it's an intracellular parasite, was introduced in the 1900s, they began to spread avian malaria to the birds. But for a long time, this all just sort of simmered along at low elevations because of these cold refuges in the middle of our islands. And so what has happened in really, really recent time, to get back to your question, is that the climate has warmed, the hydrological cycles have dried out such that we now have mosquito breeding habitat year round in many, many high elevation places in the Hawaiian Islands, especially on Kauai and Maui, and a little bit lesser extent on the Big Island, on Hawaii Island. And so these days, we now see that mosquitoes can breed year round in those environments. And so these are data from 2022 when we set out to do mosquito trapping across 6 different sites on the Alakai Plateau and Kokee on Kauai. So island of Kauai here, we're up here in this high elevation area. And these sites range in elevation from 1,000 meters here at the end of Campton Road, all the way up to almost 1,400 meters at Halapakai. And you can see that at this point, by 2020, mosquitoes have invaded. This particular mosquito that transmits avian malaria has spread to every part of the plateau. There is nowhere safe for the forest birds anymore. And this has happened in the last couple of decades. So back to your question, do they not have time to evolve? The answer is no. The mosquitoes are invading so quickly, and the generation time is so short in these, or too long in these birds. There's just not enough turnover to allow for mutation and all the things that natural selection needs. And their population sizes are so small. So back to that first slide I showed you, of those 8 birds, I think only one species numbers more than 10,000 individuals. So most of the species now are down in a few thousands or few hundreds of individuals, and there just simply isn't enough different chances of random mutations happening when you have those kinds of small populations to allow the birds to adapt to a threat that's happening this quickly. And it's changing like before our eyes. So here's top left, 2021, 3 of those 6 sites, and then 2022. And over that small time, the rates of mosquito capture, so this is the number of mosquitoes we catch per trap per night, at one site went from 4 to 6, so 50% greater in a year. It's happening fast before our eyes. And so at the same time, and this is the last slide I want to show, just as an example of why, you know, the situation is so dire. This bird, this akikiki, in the core of its range, which is this where this blue arrow comes from down here, this is Halapakai. This is our highest elevation site. It has been extirpated. It has gone from 35 breeding pairs in 2015 to 0 breeding pairs in 2022. So there is a crisis at hand. That is not a myth, but there are things we can do about it. And I'm happy if anyone wants to hear about what some of the solutions are, I'm happy to speak to some of those things too.
Callie, that's a sad little bird and a sad story. We have one question in the Q&A. You mentioned these very low populations. What, for a forest bird, what is a population that could be self-sustaining and stable?
I think we're thinking 5,000 or better.
5,000 or better.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much only the, what's the one that is high, Amakihi?
No, Apapane numbers more than 10,000 individuals. Kauai Amakihi numbers only 7,000 individuals.
Okay.
I think Anianiao is about 10,000. We are doing the forest bird surveys on Kauai this year, and we'll have much better data. Our data is now 5 years old because we did the last surveys in 2018. But on Kauai, we only have 2,000 DEV as of last count.
Yeah.
It's not like the situation on the Big Island. Oh, and I promised to circle back to the pig story. So on the Big Island and in other places where the soil is far more porous than it is on Kauai, the wallowing activity by pigs and the excavation of hapu'u cavities that pigs do is a really important source of mosquito breeding habitat because those things trap water in which mosquitoes can breed. Here on Kauai, our soils are not nearly as porous. In fact, earlier I referred to the sort of the boggy plateau, and we have plenty of other water sources in which mosquitoes can breed. And we have plenty of bog in which pigs can wallow, but interestingly enough, we rarely see mosquito larvae in those places. Where we do see mosquito larvae on Kauai is in stream margins, where water gets sort of splashed up out of the stream and sits there, and along a lot of anthropogenic sources. So the tire ruts we make, the ditches from the sugarcane era, the boardwalk in Kokee. So in a way, one of the easiest things we can do to solve this mosquito problem is to, you know, kind of pick up after ourselves and make sure we're reducing all those anthropogenic mosquito sources.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have one other question in the chat that I'm actually going to hold for Nicolai. It came up with your talk, but I'm going to let Nicolai and then you answer it later, but I'm going to move on to Nick. I guess for the myths that I'd throw out for you are, haven't pigs always been in the forests? Aren't they, and then maybe not a myth, but a question, is there a level of pig population or feral animal population that can be maintained in a healthy forest and yet have hunting opportunities?
You want me to answer that right now or just jump into my?
You're on.
Well, I made a
You can
presentation
go,
to answer
it's a
those
leading
questions.
question, but you can go in the direction you want to.
All right, let me pull up my presentation. It's a very quick presentation. Well, I hope it's quick. You get me talking about pigs and I might not shut up for a while. So let's see. Where's the share screen option? Share screen and share. And let's see if I can get it into presenter mode. Does it look okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, so so myth number one about feral pigs in Hawaii, I thought would be fun to address. We kind of have pigs everywhere nowadays, and I think the assumption is that because they're everywhere now, they must have went wild right when people brought them, possibly 1,000 years ago. So myth, Polynesians brought the pigs. The pigs have been wild ever since, including in ancient Hawaii days. And I started doing extensive research. It's unpublished, but I was looking for the presence and absence of pigs and all these old accounts of people doing mountaineering adventures in the mountains, and it just accounts in general in anything that I could find. And it was interesting is, you know, some of the earlier ones I could find, essentially they're not described as in the forest by anybody going into the mountains. And so the earliest accounts I could find, Oahu, pretty early, 1837 above Honolulu. In Kauai, 1840, in Kokee, 1850, in Kalihiwai, 1860 on the east side. There's not a whole lot of accounts of mountaineering on Kauai before that, so that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't in these places. On the Big Island, William Ellis talks about them. He might have, it wasn't really specified where, he said some forests might have had pigs, so maybe some forests had pigs by 1820, but it's really until like 1857 in the region of Saddle Road that you start to see a lot of people talking about feral pigs in the mountains. And it's at this place, it's called Kalaeha. It's when you go up Saddle Road and you get above the forest and you hit those pastures that are on the north side. I think maybe it's Kamehameha School's land or DHHL or something. And that was one of the places where people see pigs over, and they talk about the pigs over and over again. And a lot of it's just because there's a lot of people going up to the tops of the mountains, so you get a lot of accounts talking about it. But then interestingly, East Maui, or on Maui in general, I didn't find any accounts of wild pigs until much later. 1915 on the northeast side was the earliest. Kipahulu supposedly didn't have pigs until the 1940s. Supposedly West Maui didn't have pigs until the 1960s when they brought wild pigs from East Maui to West Maui. Although there was one exception, I found the account that said above Waihe'e apparently had pigs being hunted in 1880, which is kind of an anomaly. But yeah, Molokai, Lanai, Kaho'olawe, Niihau, much later. Oh, except for Kaho'olawe. So yeah, it seems as though they weren't in ancient Hawaii. There weren't feral pigs in ancient Hawaii, at least not widespread. You guys see that, or is it being covered up by anything?
We can see it.
Okay, so another myth, the wild pigs of today, they're foreign breeds and they bear no resemblance to the smaller Polynesian pig of old. And it's kind of I guess the genetics of pigs in Hawaii is kind of a complex story. Every island is different. There's probably like a founder effect going on, you know. Whatever the breeds happen to be in any population when it did go wild, it's probably what dominated those areas. You can imagine them even like spreading perhaps at a certain rate and then even merging with other expanding populations. That might be a whole different breed or breed mix. But yeah, there's a lot of genetic evidence these days to indicate that Polynesian pig genetics are present in the wild pigs of Hawaii, or at least on Kauai, Oahu, and Maui. I have a theory there might not be any Polynesian pig on Maui, but see. So if the Polynesian pig is there, you know, what does it look like? Like what is this pig? And so I found a couple of accounts. So William Ellis, he was talking about the Polynesian pig in Tahiti. And from 1831, he described it. He said it was somewhat smaller than the pigs were nowadays, referring to the pigs in 1820. It had long legs, long nose, curly or almost woolly hair. So keep that in mind. And short, erect ears. The ears are perked. And then another account I found was from a whaler in the 1830s. And he was describing the pigs that are on a kind of a remote island somewhere in the Pacific. And he said I'll just read the quote. They still exhibit the gaunt form, acute snout, arched back, high tail, pricked ears, small deer-like feet of the Aboriginal Polynesian breed. Their prevailing color is black. Their bristles are long and shaggy. The skin beneath has a thick covering of short, crisp hairs closely resembling wool. The old boars have tusks of that size, and he mentioned the tusks get thick. So, and then in Hawaii we have a study on pigs from it was finished in 1972, started by Nichols in the 1960s, finished by Giffen, so it's called the Giffen study. But in that study, they described the pigs on Mauna Kea, and bear in mind this is one of the earliest places that had wild pigs. So in 1962, Giffen's mentioned he's in a conference and he says the pigs up there, they're predominantly black in color, have heavy coats with long bristles and a woolly undercoat. So again, that woolly undercoat, high shoulders, sloping hindquarters, long snouts, large hairy pointed ears, and long tufted tails. Old boars develop a formidable tusks and heavy shields, along with shoulders and ribcage. The young are often born with the longitudinal stripes typical of the young of European boar. And that's something that you see on the other islands. I haven't found an old account that actually corroborates that, but possible that they have a certain stripe pattern on the piglets. And so, here's a couple of pigs that I've harvested along the years. So the one on the left is on Kauai from Waimea Canyon area. Kind of got the same classical appearance that it has high shoulders, it's black in color. I think one thing that's important is the forehead it's like a straight forehead. It doesn't have that upturned cranium that you see with feral pigs. It's got a flat forehead that's more resembling of a Eurasian wild boar. And they're supposed to be early domestication, so that would make sense. It's got that straight tail with the tuft at the end, and here I kind of highlighted the importance of this short, crisp wool that's under the hair, and you can see it on both these pigs. So the one's in Waimea and Kauai, the other one is from actually on Mauna Kea, and the Mauna Kea one has very prominent underwool, almost you can see the curls in it. They have black in color. I think that one's brown, probably because it's covered in mud. And so again, so another myth, Polynesian pig was a small pig weighing about 50 pounds. And I had to go back and look for accounts of the Polynesian pig in these different islands in the Pacific from like first encounters. And there's some really great books on the matter, written by the people who were there. And they often record the sizes of pigs. And yeah, there are a lot of small pigs being traded, but sometimes they mention pigs that are 90 pounds. It doesn't seem like they're ever over 100 pounds. But yeah, I would think that like a full size pig is roughly 90 or 100 pounds. But then when the Cook expedition came to, when they're in Hawaii, they're doing well, first they said the pigs here are somewhat larger than the rest of Polynesia. So they said it's the same pig, but it's a little bit bigger in Hawaii. And maybe it's because of agricultural surplus. But in Kealakekua Bay, they're doing a salted meat technique. And they mentioned that they used pigs that were, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 to 14 stone is the measurement they use, but a stone is, I think it's 14 pounds or so. It came out to, the pigs used were 52 to 168 pounds. So yeah, possible that the Polynesian pigs in Hawaii were around that size. And then when you look at that Giffen study, and they're doing the study on the pigs on Mauna Kea, and the pigs up there when they're full size averaged 90 pounds for sows and 110 pounds for boars. So right in that range. So it could be that we have nearly purebred Polynesian pigs up there, or some mix that may be dominated by Polynesian pigs. And then people think, they're smaller, they cause less damage, maybe they persisted in low numbers. There's all these theories to kind of explain why there didn't seem to be this explosion in pigs until kind of into the 1800s. Seems to be expressed by Warschauer. But it seems to me that as soon as they went feral, they seemed to cause a lot of damage. And I think they just weren't there yet. And as soon as they were there, they caused a bunch of damage, and they were also utilized as a resource. So, here's an account from somebody writing under the pen name Hualalai, and they're publishing in the paper these accounts of them going up on Mauna Kea. And so he writes, at Kalaeha, we remained until Thursday. Rambling about the country, shooting wild hogs, geese, and ducks. The latter were not very plentiful, but the hogs were countless, and The hogs were in countless numbers. The ground for miles about our camp was plowed up in every direction by them in their search after the roots upon which they fed. So yeah, there you have an account where, they're causing a lot of damage even back then. And that might be purebred Polynesian pigs up there, or nearly purebred. So yeah, I mean, how do you explain why there wasn't pigs in ancient Hawaii? I think in a nutshell, the Hawaiians probably just kept their pigs contained. Apparently there's 3 ways that feral pig populations can establish, and this is something that's true around the world. There's accidental releases. So in Hawaii, you can imagine like maybe there's like a homestead and everybody dies of one of those disease outbreaks that happened in the 1800s. Something like that could have happened countless times. Free-range pig farming, that's a huge one. So like Kipahulu, Maui, that was the source of wild pigs sprouting up in Kipahulu, Maui in the 1940s. And then translocation of existing wild pigs. So, think of those pigs from East Maui being brought to West Maui. And all 3 ways did happen in Hawaii. So it's kind of a complex story. And then I just want to point out, pigs in ancient Hawaii, they're coveted by the elite, and they're really guarded as a source of mana. So. And that's kind of more about the pigs, but yeah, exponential growth of pig populations. It might be true of populations that are starting out. You can imagine like 5 pigs in a neighborhood quickly turning to 9 or more, or even 14 the next year if nothing's done. But it seems as though, we see these remote areas and they seem to have stable populations. So they seem to be in some sort of equilibrium with their habitat. I would imagine they cause a lot of damage to get there. But yep, that's what I got. Stop sharing.
Great. And the other question was answered on this. Nick, I want to move on, although I neglected to do a survey. I understand that Hess has a survey we're supposed to do. So if Kylie can offer the survey of our participants now before people have to go home, and then we'll move on to Ryan. So you should be participants. I guess there are 3 questions. Participants, our poll participants can, there we go. People start filling that out. Panelists, I guess we can't do it. We don't count for this.
I was trying to click on it before I saw that we can't count.
I was doing the same thing. Hey, oh no, it's not taking my input on it.
All right, I hope I didn't take too long on that presentation.
Yeah,
That was my first time I did it.
It's all good. When I lived in the mountains of the northern Philippines, and there was a wild pig which had a long snout, what I remember, but it was small. It was like 20-30 pounds with a long snout, and very distinct from the domestic pigs that people had. Once in a while, someone would catch a wild one and bring it in. They said they'd have to feed it corn for a while to fatten it up before butchering it. But that sounds more like the Polynesian pig.
Sometimes those environments too, the wild environment often doesn't have that great of food resources, and they just don't get that big.
Yeah, I'll believe that too.
I heard once, I don't know how true this is, probably making myths.
Okay,
I heard
we're
that
done. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'll hold my tongue.
Okay, we're done. I'll quickly share the results of where people are coming from, just because I can. And it looks like most people are from Hawaii Island and Kauai, the 2 ends of the archipelago. All right, moving on to Ryan. Ryan, what I wanted to ask you about is how we see rapid ʻōhiʻa that's spreading through the forest, and is it inevitable that it's just going to burn through the forest? And what do you see? What can you tell from your landscape observations, Arad?
Sure. I don't know if that's the myth idea, but first of all, hello everybody. Nice to be here, and great to hear from the other 3 panelists on here. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, I'm happy to speak a little bit about what we're seeing. So my group does a lot of remote sensing to look at changes in the forest, and with an emphasis over the last 5 years or so on changes associated with rapid ʻōhiʻa death, and kind of detecting new cases and outbreaks and monitoring change over time. And we do that at different scales. We do that over, relatively small areas, 50 to a couple hundred acres, and we do that with drones, or we do it over larger areas with helicopters, or we do it even on kind of island-wide scales with satellite imagery. And what we often see is an area will first, have cases of ʻōhiʻa mortality will start, and we'll see this kind of this pulse of mortality occur, and all at once you see many trees starting to turn this reddish brown color. It's very obvious to your eyes. I'm sure many people on Hawaii Island at least have seen this, and some folks on Kauai as well. And then that lasts about a year or two, actually, of pretty striking cases of new trees popping up. And then what we often see is that initial pulse of mortality starts to slow down, and then we see kind of slower continued drips and drops of mortality. But it doesn't stop. That's one thing that we've noticed in some cases. We've been monitoring for more than a decade with some old historic imagery. We see these sort of things take off and then slow down a little bit, but they continue to persist. So what we see by and large are continued mortality over time. That I've heard people, concerns about, oh, we're going to lose all the ʻōhiʻa. The ʻōhiʻa are going to, go extinct. And thankfully, I don't think we're, I don't think we're in that scenario. It's very different than, the birds that Cali was talking about, right? Where there very much is a real danger. We're talking about dozens, and these guys are already, species winking out. I don't think that's the case for ʻōhiʻa, certainly not on Hawaii Island. We still have, likely millions of healthy trees out there, but there are definitely places where the sustained and really unfortunate, continued mortality from rapid ʻōhiʻa death, on top of these additional, pressures the forest is feeling from invasive species and other things. There's some not good trajectories out there. I don't know if I helped to answer that myth or question, JB, but those are some initial observations.
No, that's good. And I will say, we have hundreds of millions of ʻōhiʻa. So our estimate, which you contributed to, is we've lost over 1 million so far to rapid ʻōhiʻa death, but statewide we have hundreds of millions. So it's not looking like it's going to extinction, but in certain areas, it's been pretty devastating.
Yeah, for sure. In certain pockets, unfortunately, we've seen localized complete mortality, where over small areas, all the ʻōhiʻa do die. But at site levels, the highest levels that my group has monitored is about 35% at this point. So a bit more than a third of all the ʻōhiʻa trees. And then that 2/3 are left. But again, if you're in these lowland forests, that doesn't provide a lot of opportunities for ʻōhiʻa seedlings to sprout because of grazing pressure and other invasive plants that are going to kind of shade those guys out. Yeah, the trajectory is not a good one, but we are definitely not in danger of losing all of our ʻōhiʻa by any means.
Well, so the other thing that we hear sometimes is there's nothing we can do about it, and it's true that there's no way of flying helicopters over and spraying fungicides on the forest and killing all the rod fungus, but there are ways that we can protect our forest. Do you want to address that?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say that that it is a myth that we can't do anything about it. I think that there's a few different things that we can do, and actually I'll share. I'm going to try to be like everybody else and share some slides here, if I can. Let me see here, screen 2. And one of the things we can do relates to land management and fencing. and ungulates. We do know that forests that have had ungulates removed from the forest, so not just fencing alone, but the ungulates have been removed, we see a much lower incidence of mortality in those areas than we do where we do have, feral pigs Nick was just talking about, and other feral animals. This is an image we collected from a recent helicopter flight over an area down in Ka'u on Hawaii Island, around Kaihulena, where this is, a very common what we see for an unfenced area. And I don't want to run out of time here, but you've got those white guys, which are older ʻōhiʻa mortality, and then those reddish brown ones are more recent cases of mortality. And if we compare that to an area which has been fenced and the ungulates, kept out, right, it is a very different story. And so this is, same climatic regime, same age of substrate, everything's the same, except, on one side, we removed the ungulates, on the other, we haven't. And we see this in these very dramatic, spatial patterns. So this is Brian Tucker, a colleague of ours, put this together from a satellite image, and it shows a pretty striking story. Within that purple outline, the animals have been kept out, and we see much lower incidence of mortality. And in the surrounding areas where their ungulates are still present, we see a lot more cases of mortality. There's some exciting things happening with ʻōhiʻa resistance, where we're trying to identify strains of ʻōhiʻa which are more resistant, and maybe outplanting those. And so there's a number of really exciting things that are happening, but certainly things that we can do is better manage and protect our forests. I can.
So Ryan, I want to point out that in this image that we're looking at here, the spots are images of trees that from the aerial survey appear to have been died or dying of rapid ʻōhiʻa death, and subsamples. This imagery interpretation has been tested with probably hundreds of actual samples in the field, and saying someone did not go to each one of those dots that you're seeing there, but hundreds were sampled, and it's a pretty good probability that those trees died of rapid ʻōhiʻa death.
Yes, that's an important point. So from any kind of imagery, imaging spectroscopy or RGB imagery, we can identify, trees that we suspect have the pathogen, but until you actually take a physical sample and test in the laboratory, we don't know for sure. But we have a very good, nice, tight correlation between, the symptomatic crowns that we've identified, and that indeed they do suffer from infection by the pathogen.
Okay, thanks. Well, we are at 5, but I don't think any of us are running off. Are there any other questions for Ryan in particular? And then we have 2 things to circle back about pigs. If Nick, if you can hang on and talk about pigs some more. Tom.
Yeah, I do have to take off, but before I go, I did want to have ask a question for Ryan and for JB. So when you see these patterns within the unfenced areas, and you have this sequence of kind of a peak in infection rate and then a decline, what is the explanation for that? Do you have any idea why it happens that way? And how much of it might be due to genetic variation where there is resistance to this pathogen?
Yeah, that's part of the $1 million question that we're wrestling with. But there's a number of different hypotheses that have been put forth. One is that big storm events, right? So Hurricane Iselle, or these storm events which can cause lots of broken branches. The pathogen enters the tree through wounds, right? So you need to have some kind of a wound on the tree for it to get infected. If you douse it with inoculum, but the bark is intact, the tree's not going to get sick or die. You have to have these openings. And so the openings can be caused by broken branches from storms. They could also be caused by ungulates or people, right? Machinery that's breaking branches because you're putting in a new fence line or something like that. So any way that you are creating openings in the tree, that's where you're getting these pathways for the inoculum to get in there. And then again, back to the idea of potential storm events, they could also bring in the inoculum through these wind patterns and then sort of, douse an area. If that area has broken branches, then that can cause this sort of initial pulse, right? But then these areas, the mortality is persisting for years, right? In some places, now we're unfortunately, on more than a decade. And so most likely there's secondary spread that's also occurring after this initial event where you see all these trees going off at once. And I believe, and there's a lot of good evidence that secondary spread is related to likely, ungulates, pigs are moving things around, but also the frass production from beetle activity. So boring beetles going into the trees, kicking out frass, and then that getting carried around in different ways. JB, I'm sure you have some additional things to add.
Well, I just, that model of an event causing an outbreak is backed up by genetics. There are the geneticists can look at the genotypes of an outbreak and trace it to where it seems to have come from. So a Kohala outbreak is distinctly different from a Hamakua outbreak. So it does appear there's one event that caused the initial outbreak, but then the trajectory of the disease is, you get this big increase and then it slows down, but it never levels off. So then probably localized transmission with that.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to have to take off.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me on the panel, and nice to meet everybody. Sure.
But,
Okay, thanks so much, Tom. Ryan, a question in the Q&A for you, easy one. Can you use multispectral satellite imagery to identify rapid ʻōhiʻa death based on spectral signatures or machine learning, or are you visually looking at dead canopies from aerial images?
Yeah. So yeah, I was just actually talking about this a little bit this morning at the Rod Science meeting. So yes, we are using machine learning to try to automate the detections from satellite imagery and also the drone and helicopter imagery that we collect. The spectral signature of rapid ʻōhiʻa death, that's still a challenging one. So we can there's definitely a spectral signature of ʻōhiʻa trees, which are the circulation internally is shutting down. And so, but it's not that different from what drought looks like. And it's not that different from what just a broken branch looks like. And so being able to definitively say, oh, that tree crown is turning reddish brown, and that's because of rapid ʻōhiʻa death, and I know that from the spectral signature, that's I think still a little bit unclear. But we can certainly identify when these trees are stressed and dying. But yes, indeed, we are making good progress with using convolutional neural networks and other sort of artificial intelligence approaches, both with my group and then at Arizona State University, Greg Asner's group's doing some really, really wonderful things. So we're making good strides on the remote sensing side. But but in my lab, at least, we still do some verification with good old, human intelligence and trained analysts.
Nick?
Yeah, I got a question for Ryan. Ryan, at Helena, is that does those forests outside the fence, do they have just pigs, or do you know if they have wild cattle too?
JB, I don't want to misspeak. I don't know if you know off the top of your head.
I don't know. I believe there are also wild cattle in there, but I don't know for sure. I've heard it said. I have heard it said there are a lot of wild cattle up there. Yes.
They're very destructive to forests.
And here's another interesting point. It seems that because in the adjoining ranch that have cattle that are tame and watered and cared for, even though it's an ʻōhiʻa forest with cattle, you don't see anywhere near as much rod as you do when you go over the fence into the state forest with the feral cattle.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, right? And I think, the feral ungulate story, there's still a lot to learn about that. And not all feral animals or not all ungulates are the same, right? So as JB was mentioning, if you've got a well taken care of, ranch setting, typically we don't see the types of mortality that we do when you've got a feral situation. So it is, yeah, I just want to certainly be careful about that.
I want to address a question in the Q&A. What will the impact of rod and reduced ʻōhiʻa cover be on the other species in native forest? And Cali answered it as far as the birds go. And yes, there was a paper published by showing that actually in Lower Puna, Amakihi, I think, were recolonizing some of the lower elevation forests until rod came, and then it kind of blew away their habitat there. But the other thing that happens in the lower elevation forest is the weeds take over. When you open up that canopy, all the sun-loving weeds and the clydemia and the itchgrass and everything else comes in and takes over. So it is catastrophic to the native understory trees, shrubs, herbaceous at lower elevations. The island-wide survey of plots that have rapid ʻōhiʻa death in them only found ʻōhiʻa regenerating above 3,000 feet. So those forests below 30,000 feet, there are seeds. The remaining ʻōhiʻa seed out, they throw out seeds. If you look on a rock wall or gravel something, you see ʻōhiʻa seedlings sprouting, but they're outcompeted by the weeds.
I think also an important difference between Kauai and the Big Island as far as the potential impact is that we sort of have one, well, not one, but we have one major ʻōhiʻa forest left and then a lot of really small patches. And we don't have nearly the extent of forest that, patches, mosaic that you have on Hawaii Island, where species can hide during a rod outbreak and then later recolonize from. I mean, if rod were to take off in the Alakai on Kauai, that's our one big patch. So then where would things go? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, JB and Ryan.
Concern.
Yeah. Well, and the rare plants are localized. Like one spot that there's a native Sertandra down in Nanavale, right? And that forest has been completely decimated. And that only is within, 10 miles radius of the habitat of that plant. So for rare plants, it's pretty severe for that.
Maybe, can I use that quickly as a segue to something that you asked me before we all got on the webinar? And then I know you probably have things up, but you asked me what the purpose of forest restoration is. And I guess in some ways, maybe I'm thinking that Hurricane Iniki and the damage it did on Kauai is a parallel for what rod might do, like just sort of really weakening the forest, and rod would do the same thing. I mean, it would just leave it so we don't have a big continuous patch of forest, but we have smaller patches of forest and less healthy forests. And this is just an idea that has occurred to me, so maybe it's not an accurate comparison, but it just an idea. But to me, the forest birds on Kauai are already, if you think of the story as the three little pigs, they're already living in a straw house. And so anything that comes along is just going to blow and blow and blow that house down, right? And because we're still dealing with the impacts of Hurricane Iniki, and because we're dealing with one relatively large intact tract of forest and not a whole lot of habitat. And so I do actually think that anything we can do to improve the quality of the forest in terms of fencing out ungulates and keeping rot at bay and everything, hopefully helps us move that house from a straw house to a thick house, and then maybe one day a brick house that leaves the whole system more resilient to the next impact. And if the birds have more food, if they have, they are just not going to be these little birds that are sort of always just eking out an existence, which I feel like they are now. And so maybe they are less susceptible to disease and more likely to combat the next thing that comes their way. And so to me, forest restoration is supremely important, even in the face of something catastrophic like avian disease, because it just means our whole system is more resilient.
Yeah, I think part of the point also with the weeds, it's multiple stresses will take out the forest.
Right.
Maybe one stress, it will be resilient and be able to come back.
Yeah, the death of many cuts or whatever they call it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have one question in the chat I'd like to throw back to Nick. It's about whether feral pigs are regularly killed by citizens, which I would take to mean hunting in the Forest Service. I will correct that Forest Service actually doesn't manage any land here, so they don't do any pig, but Division of Forestry and Wildlife does pig management. Do you want to say something about what they're doing? Because I think Nick, do you want to talk about how pig management is done by the agencies that manage it? And then, I don't know how popular hunting is.
Yeah, so pigs are probably the most hunted, the most popular game animal in the state. And we have a vibrant public hunting program here in Hawaii where public lands have these hunting units that are set up, and people can, licensed hunters can go and hunt for pigs and other animals. And so, yeah, there's a very vibrant hunting culture in Hawaii. I mean, one hunting unit in the Kokei area on Kauai regularly gets 1,500 hunter days every year. That's just one spot, you know. Just about like 50 hunters a weekend. So yeah, we hunt a lot for pigs here. And then on top of that, there are fence units on the islands in various locations where they've excluded the animals for the purpose of forest protection and watershed protection and endangered species protection, and where the state staff and partners will go up and they will clear animals out of the unit. And generally those numbers barely compare to what is taken out by the public hunting programs.
Yeah, my understanding is usually if there's a new unit, they bring in, you know, sport hunters to hunt as much as they can before cleaning up the rest by whatever the land management agency is.
They give them first crack. That was a standard procedure.
Yeah. And then there are staff hunters sometimes if an area is been fenced out and you know, there's low number of pigs, but then they see some pigs get in, staff hunters will go in and get those pigs out. But a lot of the forests are managed for populations of pigs and other animals for hunting.
And some places are really remote, some places aren't, some places have a lot more pigs than other places.
I think one of the issues is that there's decreasing access to the state forests that are open for hunting because of the collapse of the plantation industry. I know on this island, when I moved here, you could drive up any Cane Hall Road and into the forest, and that land has all been sold out and many of those have been gated. So there's quite a lot of forest that there's no public access to. And so there's less hunting pressure. And in the past 5 years, we've seen a heck of a lot of pigs coming into suburbia and tearing up people's gardens. And I think partly because there's no pressure because there's no access to a lot of the forests.
Yep, exact same thing happened on Kauai.
And I know that's something that our colleagues at Division of Forestry and Wildlife are working on. You try to negotiate access. It's a win-win if you can do it, but it's a difficult negotiation.
Yeah, and on Kauai, we made a list of hunters for those people to contact if they have problems. I'm trying to push that out.
One more question, and I think we're going about 15 minutes over time with it, but this is back to you, Cali. Why can't you just move the birds to Hawaii Island?
So it's actually under discussion, we have been looking at that possibility. We have been assessing the various qualities of different suitable parcels, including Hakalau, on the Big Island where we might want to consider a translocation. And so the reasons, so for some species that might happen. So for those species for which it might happen, it needs to be the species where there are larger population size to draw from, because you need to be able to move a fair number of birds without damaging the source population in case it doesn't work. And you need to be able to catch those birds, and you need to know that they have sort of ecological characteristics that are compatible with the place that you're moving them to, and you don't want them to be competitors of species that are already there. So for example, the akikiki that I showed earlier is a creeper species, and there is a creeper on the Big Island already. So would you want to introduce them and have them potentially compete with each other?
And our creeper is endangered as well.
And your creeper is endangered as well, right? And for the akikiki in particular, that's not that tool is off the table, because with only 45 birds left, we don't really have the room to gamble. The other obstacle to moving birds to the other islands is that it is a lot of paperwork, because these are all single island endemics that you're moving from one island to an island that's outside their range, which for endangered species just requires, it's not impossible, but it requires jumping through extra hoops. But the biggest problem is that we're not really sure for how much longer the Big Island is going to have a lot of mosquito-free habitat. And so right now you guys have a lot more elevation up there that is mosquito-free, but with the rapidity of which the landscapes have changed on Kauai and Maui, by the time we got all this paperwork done, would there still be mosquito-free habitat on the Big Island? And so there is a research program on the Big Island trying to address that question, just as I'm addressing the amount of mosquito-free habitat, which is non-existent on Kauai. But it is under discussion, for example, for the Akoi from Maui, a translocation to the Big Island is being considered a more robust population. So for the Kauai birds right now, it's not on the table.
All right. Well, I
Right.
want to thank our audience. 3/4 of our audience is stuck with us through 15 minutes extra. A lot of questions, a lot of good questions. I do want to thank all our panelists and joining us for this talk on the Invasive Species Awareness Month and busting a few myths. And thanks also to Tom Giambelluca. But thanks, guys, for coming on. It's been a really good conversation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Hello, everybody.
Uh,
Aloha. Thank you.
Aloha.